In this video, we're going to take a quick look at how to create shelf tools in Houdini. Shelf tools are a great way to create small tools to make your life a little bit easier. We'll be using them to demonstrate a bunch of Python principles this week. In order to create a new shelf tool, you must first create a new shelf. So let's look at how to do that. So up here you see all of the shelves that Houdini ships with, and then here you see a little plus icon. And if we click on that, we can see this new shelf. We can also add pre-existing shelves, or we can go into this shelf thing and add more pre-existing shelves. But for now, let's create our own new shelf. So if we click the new shelf button, you'll notice that we get a path to save it to, and for now I'm just going to leave it at default.shelf. The name of the shelf is something that's recognized internally by Houdini, which we may or may not actually get into in this course. But for now, just name it something that makes sense, like Python _class. As is usual with names in Houdini, you can't have any spaces in it. It has to be underscores instead. For the label, this is the label that's actually going to show up here on the tab itself. So we should name that something logical, like, say, Python class. And in this case, we can use a space. So if we hit apply, here's our brand new shelf. Now, there are a couple of different ways to get tools onto a shelf in Houdini. The simplest way is to right-click and say Edit Shelf. And then we're back to this dialog. We can go to the Tools tab, and here's a list of all the tools that it can see. So we can just add them if we want. Say we want to add active value, which is a dot tool. There it is. Now, for the purposes of this video, we're just going to be creating all of our own tools, so let's just go ahead and remove that. So to remove it, just click it again, it goes away, and hit apply again, and it's gone. And then let's just hit accept to get rid of that dialog. Now to create our own tool, what we can do is come up here to our shelf, right-click anywhere on the shelf and say New Tool. And notice that it creates a new tool right there with the default icon. Now, once again, we have an internal name that we can give it, which is, again, with underscores. So we could call it something like display dialog, because that's what we're going to do here. And then for the label, we can just give it a label that makes sense, like, again, display dialog. And that's the label that'll be displayed here instead of new tool. So if we hit apply, there it is. And notice that my name is a little bit too long, so it just goes to ... That's okay. So now we have our very first shelf tool, and if we click on it, it does nothing. And that's because we need to put something on the script tab. So let's put something in here. Now if you remember back in week 1, we talked about how to display dialogues through Python. So let's just go ahead and make it do that. So if we click in here, notice the script language is Python by default, so we could change that to AkeScript if we want, but let's leave it at Python because this is a Python class. So if we click in here, we can just say who.ui.displayMessage. And who.ui.displayMessage is sort of the standard way for us to display information to the user. And throughout this course, this is mainly what we're going to be using. So for text, we can just give it something like blurg, close parentheses. Okay, so let's take a look at how this works. So if we hit apply, and we just click on our button now, it brings up blurg. So that's pretty cool. So let's just take a look at some of the other things that we can do with shelf tools. So if we want to, we can go to the help tab and we can write help in here. There's actually a whole wiki help that you could use for this. But in this case, we'll just type something like, this is an awesome tool that displays a dialog on the screen. Woohoo! And hit apply. And now if I go to this guy and I right click and I say help, There's my help text. The next thing that we're going to look at is the context tab. And this is where some of the really powerful parts of shelves comes out a little bit. The way that SideFX uses shelf tools is mainly to create nodes, which is certainly a legitimate use for shelf tools, and it's kind of it's probably one of the more controversial uses of shelf tools, actually. But in my experience, one of the most common ways to use shelf tools in production is to make modifications to your network. So the cool thing about having contexts is, say we click on the SOP context, so make sure that that's checked, and then we hit apply. If we click into the network editor and we hit tab, we can now type display dialog, and there it is. And that'll only show up in SOPs. So if we went up to object level and then hit tab and type display, there's nothing. It's just a DOP network. But if we check OBJ and hit apply, click into the network editor, hit tab and type display dialog, there it is. And now if we click on it, it just runs the code that we have. And there are actually ways in Houdini to get access to where you are in the network and what's going on in the viewport and stuff like that from your shelf tools, which we'll go over later in the course. For now, let's just click OK and show you guys before we move on to hotkeys is the tab submenu path. So for tab submenu path, this is basically where it's going to be in the tab menu, exactly like it sounds. So I could say blorg here, hit apply, click into the network editor, and then hit tab, and there's blorg, and there's display dialog. So if we wanted to have it in a submenu, we would just do blorg/fawn, for example, and hit apply. And if we click into the network editor and hit tab, blorg, fawn, display dialog. So in this way, not only can we add our tools into the network editor, but we can also organize them there as well. So if people aren't necessarily familiar with all the tools that we've made, we could just dump them all into one folder in here. And they could just go to our blorg folder and be like, oh, there's a fawn category. Oh, there's this awesome display dialog tool. Let's see what that does. Oh, it displays this really cool dialog. That's really cool. Okay, so the next thing that I want to talk about is how to assign hotkeys. So if we go to the hotkeys tab, so the way that this works is there are different types of panes in Houdini, and your hotkey is going to work in one or all of them. So you could have your hotkey only work if your cursor's in the scene viewer, or you could have it work if it's only in the network pane, or you could have it work no matter where your cursor is. I usually put hotkeys under global, but it really depends on what it is and what you want to use it for. So the way that you assign a hotkey is you just hit edit, and if you're used to assigning hotkeys in Houdini in general, then this is the exact same dialog. All you have to do is find your tool over here, which Houdini has very helpfully selected this for me already. Click in here where it says assign keys, and then you have to actually click twice so that it says press any key, and then it's ready to take a hotkey. So I usually avoid using just single character hotkeys, and there's actually a lot of hotkeys already in Houdini. I don't like overriding them if I can help it. So I'll usually make it something like Control-Alt-Shift and then some letter, like so. And in fact, this is already even also a hotkey. So in this case, if I hit undo change, it'll actually get rid of my hotkey, which I don't want. I could say force change, which is what I will in a second, and that just gets rid of the hotkey for performance monitor delete profile, which I don't really need. Or I could say force change and edit, which will change, it'll keep this hotkey under display dialog, and then it'll go over to this delete profile tool and let me edit the hotkey for that one. So let's just say force change. There it is. So I'll hit accept. It doesn't show up here right away, but if we hit accept and then right click and go to edit tool, So you basically have to close the dialog down and bring it back up again in order to get back to it. Alright, so let's hit accept and let's try it out. So hit Control Alt Shift D, and there's Blurg. So later on this week, we're going to be looking at creating some very powerful tools that help us to manage our networks in Houdini, especially when they get large and unwieldy. And we're going to learn about the Python API while we do that. Using shelf tools to do this, to create small tools for ourselves, is great not only for demonstration purposes, but also for speeding up your workflow in general.